Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Associates Meeting at SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of SIEPR, and I'm grateful that you're all with us here today. I'm also honored that we're joined today by Lareina Yee, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for McKinsey & Company. I wish that we could all be meeting together in person. We are not quite at that point here at Stanford, unfortunately, but hopefully soon. Many of the problems that Lareina will be addressing today aren't new. But this past year has really brought issues of diversity and inclusion to the forefront, with today marking the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. The amount of racial violence and social injustice, coupled with the gender inequalities at work and at home that were magnified by the pandemic, have galvanized many of us to seek changes in our workplaces and in our communities. Lareina's insights will certainly help us think these things through and continue to move us in a better direction. I'm sure that you'll have plenty of questions for Lareina, and we'll have time to get to them after her presentation and my brief conversation with her right after. You can send in your questions at any time through the link on your screens, and we'll get to as many of them as we can later in this event. And because our time is tight, I'll briefly introduce Lareina and then turn things over to her. And I could spend lots and lots of time talking about her many accomplishments and achievements over the years, but I'll just try to keep things relatively brief here. Along with serving as McKinsey's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Lareina is also the global leader of the firm's technology hardware and services practice, advising companies on innovative strategies to achieve above-market growth. She leads Women in the Workplace, a research partnership with leanin.org and the Wall Street Journal, and has co-authored a significant body of additional research, including Delivering Through Diversity and the Future of Women at Work. She writes and speaks widely on diversity and inclusion topics, including appearances in Fortune, The Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, Fox Business, and many other outlets. And in 2016, she was chosen as Working Mother of the Year by Working Mother magazine. Outside of McKinsey, Lareina is on the board of Safe and Sound, a not-for-profit focused on child abuse prevention. So with that, let me hand the proverbial mic over to you, Lareina, and thank you so much again for being with us here today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be together. And in this virtual context, I can't see all of your faces, but what I would love to do is start a bit with a fact base and share where we are at this moment, and then open it up for as many questions as we have time for. And so let me do this and share my screen. If some of you are familiar with McKinsey, we love data. And so perhaps that is actually something that brings us together as well with Mark and the group. And so I'd love to share with you a bit of the data in terms of where we are, because oftentimes it is a qualitative discussion, which is certainly important, but it's also helpful to take a temperature check of where we are and how far we have to go. So with that, why don't we get started? We'll take a look at gender, we'll take a look at diversity, and really focus more on racial diversity for this. Second. So fundamentally, first question, why does it matter? And some of you may be shaking your head saying, why are we even asking this? Isn't it obvious? And in any population, I find oftentimes there's a third who feel exactly like you. Of course, this matters, and we shouldn't even be asking this question. A third who are like, well, in fact, actually, besides social justice, I would be curious on why it matters in terms of organizational health and performance. And the third who are saying, gosh, I'm a silent dissenter. And so I'm here today to hear about this because I'd like to be convinced, I'd like to know more, because it's not obvious to me why we're spending this much time on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And the basic business case as we think about it is we think about diversity, which is a bit about accounting. Who is represented in the workforce? Who sits around a table? We think about equity in terms of the equality of opportunities created, and inclusion. How does it feel? Do you have a sense of belonging? Do you have a sense of deep connection with the organization? And we know when these three things combined work together, the experience for all men and women, and particularly women and people of color, is significantly different. So a couple of facts for those of you who like data just like myself. When we looked at our return on equity, and this is both a US number and a global number, ethnically diverse companies, management teams, were likely the order of 36% more likely to outperform less diverse companies. And if you just took a gender cut, that number is 25%. So there's an overall business case. But the one I actually like is this 3X number here, which is that when we looked at over 40,000 men and women in the United States in our Women in Workplace research, we asked them about if your organization was very strong in terms of both opportunity and fairness, how did that change your motivations as a talented employee? And it actually showed that they were 3 times more likely to stay, 3 times more likely to recommend it, and 3 times more likely to want to advance in an organization. And that's the impact that feeling that you're in an organization that has equity inclusion brings to women alone. We also know that 47% of employees are more likely to stay in a company if they perceive it to be inclusive. And one of the statistics that's not here is that when we looked at over 40,000 men and women in the United States, we found that those under 30, both men and women, just expected that diversity, equity, inclusion was table stakes into the organizations that they would be entering. So also just pointing out that there's just a generational shift in terms of what people expect. So there's basically a business performance imperative and there's a talent imperative. And there's also other things that people have talked about in terms of reflecting your customers better, reflecting society at large. That's a little bit of why it matters. So where are we? And where are we specifically from a leadership perspective in terms of the United States? Let me just share with you a snippet of what we look like at the very top, CEO roles in Fortune 500 companies. When we looked at women, there are only 34 white women CEOs among Fortune 500 companies today. There are only 5 current women of color CEOs of those Fortune 500 companies today in 2021 of all times. There are only 3 Black men CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. There are only 10 Asian men CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. There are only 17 Latinx male CEOs. And there are 429 white men leading Fortune 500 companies today. And so when we say at the very top that people of color and women are underrepresented relative to population and relative to talent potential, this is what that picture looks like. And it doesn't just matter who's at the top, it matters who's in the entire organization. And if we look at organizations, and this is a dipsy stick of where we stood before COVID. So think of this as January, February of last year, if we can even go back that far. I know I've been sitting in this room since then in my home office. But when we looked at corporate America, and this is the corporate sector, so it doesn't include the private, doesn't include the public sector, the education sector. This is a view of what it looks like from entry level, kind of first out of college or graduate school managers, and all the way up to C-suite, meaning those who report to those very CEOs that we just looked at in the Fortune 500. And a good way to ground you in this chart is at least one of the things we're looking at is the percentage of men, white men, men of color, white women, and women of color. And this shows you how we start with moderate numbers, and then that just narrows through the funnel. And one of the things that people have asked is, with just take aside people of color, just for women, have we actually seen any improvement before COVID? And my answer to that would be, actually, we have seen improvement in the top specifically. And so if you take a look at the very bottom row here, this is the change between 2015 and 2020. And we actually saw significant headway, even though there's small percentage changes, every single percent matters in C-suite and SVPs. And at the same time, we also saw that the commitment level of companies had risen significantly. So when we started this research, call it 6-7 years ago, it would be something like maybe 80% of companies would say that it was an agenda item that mattered, gender diversity and racial diversity. Now it's more like 96. So you just saw the commitment curve come up, and you also saw some of the representation come up. The challenge when we look at this is that what you find is that the break point is most significant in the early stages of that talent pipeline, so to speak. So what I'm thinking of specifically is the delta between the entry level and the manager. So to put that into sharper relief, because there are a lot of numbers on this page, for every 100 men promoted to manager from that first rung in entry to the second rung in manager, only 85 women received that very same promotion, only 71 Latinas, and only 58 Black women. And so what we found is, even though there were seeds of hope at the top, the disparities start very early and that very first broken rung. And the question on your mind is that's all very well and fine. I mean, we can kind of continue to belabor it, but COVID has changed a lot. And it absolutely has. And what we found in this is the research that we did last summer, kind of in the height of COVID. So think about this research having taken place post George Floyd, and actually with families looking into the summer without any child support schools or childcare. And so what we saw on the kind of brighter side is optimism that remote work does have the potential to improve flexibility and diversity. And that conversation we still see now, especially as companies are thinking about return to work. So more than 70% of companies last summer said that they agree that remote work can help them hire and retain more diverse employees. In a huge experiment where everyone went virtual, what people realized, and so many companies realize, is that you can hire from a larger pool of people, not necessarily where you're physically located. And that could be an unlock for diversity hiring in particular. And we also heard that even though it was a very extreme situation, many employees were saying that remote work was helping them with the flexibility that they yearned, especially for women. And that was the number one challenge that we saw prior to COVID. But at the same time, we saw some really big challenges. And one of the most shocking statistics that I had not seen in all my time looking at gender research is that over the period of COVID, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 4 were considering leaving or downshifting their careers. And in all the years that we've done this research, we had never seen attrition rates between men and women differ significantly. In fact, that was one of the myths we were excited that we had busted. It's not that women are leaving your company per se at greater rates than men, they're getting stuck and you're not promoting and advancing them. But this year is very different. And if I looked at working mothers in particular, that number was 1 in 3. So 1 in 3 women with kids at home were saying, I just can't do it. And why were they saying that? Because on average, they were working 3 to 5 hours a day in addition to their full-time work jobs with their household duties. And whilst men came in to help, the vast majority of women carried the majority of the load. And all of this in an environment where women were working mothers in particular were least likely to feel comfortable sharing the balance between the juggle of the double shift at home and the shift in the office. And were most worried last summer that the fact that they had household duties during COVID and that extra responsibilities would reflect negatively in their performance review coming up in the fall. And so in totality, that would actually erase, if all those women decided to leave the workforce or downshift, it would erase all the progress that we have been slowly making over the last 6 years. And so that's why when we say COVID has placed us in a pretty precarious crossroads, this is probably the number one thing I'm most concerned about is an exodus of women. And, people have called it a she-cession, gendered recession. And when we look at the economy at large, we see some of that playing out in the broader workspaces. We see unemployment numbers and also bounce back rates of women going into work or back into work being lower than that of men. And obviously, we're still kind of just looking at half a deck of cards. This is still playing out. But if there's one to watch for any organization, this is the one number to watch. Going into it a little bit more, what is the experience of women at work? And I'll go through this a little bit quickly. And of course, if anyone has excitement over the data, please, I'm happy to go back to this during the Q&A piece. But one of the big pieces of difference in the experience of men versus women and women of color are the impact of microaggressions. And microaggressions sounds like a kind of fancy word, or it kind of sounds like maybe a millennial term. What is it really? It comes down to very basic things that happen to you in your day-to-day work experience. Having your competence questioned, needing to provide more evidence of your answer, having your judgment questioned in your area of expertise, being overlooked, typically being interrupted or spoken over, having others take credit for your ideas, hearing demeaning remarks about you or people like you, or having people surprised at your language abilities. That has happened to me throughout my entire life, even being a native San Franciscan. I was asked several times whether my English capabilities were high enough for some of the type of work that I had in front of me, to which I just smiled and said, well, as soon as I speak, hopefully that will be self-evidently true. But these are all the microaggressions. And what you find is that men experience them far less. White women experience these far more. And if you look at the bubble chart all the way to the right, alarmingly, Black women experience many of these microaggressions 2 times more than white women, and certainly multiple times more than men. For example, needing to provide more evidence of your competence, having your judgment questioned. These are the really tough things that affect the experience of people in work underneath the numbers of representation and underneath the kind of, single pulse survey that we do once a year on employees. To be solution oriented, one of the things that we found is that allyship, in addition to mentorship and sponsorship, and I'll clarify why these are different concepts in a second, can make a huge difference. So to those depressing bubbles that I was just showing you, here are some seeds of hope. So allyship being that you stand up, speak out, and ask about those who are different from you. Mentorship, I think probably everyone's familiar with this. Sponsorship being mentorship plus opportunity creation. And in my mind, these are a trio of three concepts that if organizations apply can make a significant difference in the retention and advancement of people of color, as well as women and underrepresented groups. But simple questions. So I feel I can bring my whole self to work. It feels like an incredibly basic type of thing that you would have in any organization. Or compared to my peers in this company, I have an equal opportunity to advance. And the way to look at this chart is the bright blue bubble on the left is non-Black women, how they experience it. So 80% of non-Black women said that they feel they can bring their whole selves to work. If you look at the other side of that, Black women without allies, 41% of them felt that they could bring their whole selves to work. And then you look at the teal bubble in the middle, Black women with allies had 81%, meaning that Black women with allies, and you can take a look at all these questions, have experiences closer to that of all other women. And that gap, even though there's still a gap to men, but that gap in experience significantly closes with a single action of allyship. And what's really fascinating, I promise I won't show you the slide on this, but is that we asked how many people believe they are allies and in the workplace, and allies to Black women in particular. And it was like between 60 and 80% in any organization, managers raised their hands and said, I'm absolutely an ally. Well, as all good surveys do, we asked later about evidence of the actual actions that an ally would take. And that number drops significantly. So of the 60 to 80% in any one company who felt that as managers they were allies, when we asked specific actions, have you asked about how current events are affecting? Do you mentor or sponsor a woman of color or a person of color in your group? Lots of questions. All of those were like 20%, 15%, 10% said that they actually have done that over the course of the year. And so one of the things is allyship is a potential unlock, but it is also an execution challenge, because while people have positive intent to do it, when you actually look at the day-to-day actions that people take, there isn't that everyday allyship. And the reason it's important is we know it significantly affects the experience. Given the anniversary of George Floyd, but also just given the conversations, a lot of people have said it's really helpful to see the experience of Black women, but tell me what's going on more broadly for Black men and women overall. And as you recall, at the very beginning, I showed you that pipeline chart and mentioned that there was a broken rung at the kind of the beginning of an entry-level job to a manager job. When we did, and this is separate research that we did when we in 2021, when we looked at Black men and women in the corporate sector overall, and what this chart shows is it actually just shows all the demographics, but let's just focus on Black men and women, which is a blue line below. This research looked at both frontline workers, both hourly salary, as well as the corporate pipeline, kind of that entry level, similar to what I showed you before, manager, all the way up to executive. And what you see is that average representation would be 12% in the private sector of Black employees. And what you see is a double broken rung, which is that Black employees are well represented, in fact, overrepresented population for frontline hourly workers, but that representation drops precipitously for salaried workers. And so you see a dip there of economic security and mobility. And then within the corporate center, you've seen that same dip that we saw for gender, for Black men and women, starting at entry levels at 12% and dropping down to 7 at the manager level. And so 2 different pieces of research. This looked at a sample size of some of the largest employers in the United States. The other one looked at about 380 companies in the US, ranging from super large ones to medium ones. But what this is showing in all cases is a bit of that broken rung. And the reason to show that is that if companies want to think about actions they can take, or organizations that want to kind of show their pipeline like this, it's a focusing of where to solve the problem, not just hammering that our overall representation is low and it's a really hard problem to solve. Another piece is that we didn't just look at representation. Similarly, for Black employees, we looked at drivers of inclusion. And this is something that we've been working on and trying to understand the more science of inclusion down to the core things that drive an overall sense of inclusion in terms of trustworthiness, in terms of authenticity. And so there's sort of 9 or 10 drivers that drive inclusion. And what we found is that if you looked at the questions on the right side, agree that employees welcome diverse perspectives. Black employees and white employees in the very same company have a very different response to that question. Agree that employees are treated fairly. This is not a question of whether you are treated fairly. It's just a question of, do you perceive in your organization that employees are treated fairly? White employees are likely to say, both men and women, 77% say, I think it's pretty fair. Closer to 50% or 56% of Black employees will say, it's fair, which means it's, as fair as it's not fair in many ways. And some of the focus groups that we did really brought out this lack of trust. And when we did the inclusion survey and we looked at all the drivers, on every single driver, Black employees markedly had significantly lower scores than the rest of the employees in their organization. So when we think about kind of broader societal challenges, and we think about racial equity, one of the things that I really encourage people to think about is to take it into their own backyards, because the experience between men and women isn't very equal, and certainly the experience between Black employees and the rest of and other employees is not equal as well. And this is also just reinforcing, this last chart is reinforcing kind of when you think about the support you get in terms of sponsorship and allyship, similar kind of thing of, 87% of companies in their HR surveys told us that they have sponsorship programs. And that's great, because sponsorship is a huge unlock. But only 33% of Black employees in those same companies report having 1 or more sponsors. And I think if we reflect on our own experiences in lives, one sponsor a career does not make. You definitely need a village. And just having 1, and only 33% of them only having 1, it's in some ways not surprising earlier to the representation charts on pipeline that we see very little mobility of Black employees through to larger leadership roles. And only 23% of Black employees said that they felt a lot or quite a bit of support in their companies to advance. And so with that almost somber view of the experience and the representation statistics, oftentimes what people ask is, why has it been so hard? Because I think in my organization, we've been stuck. We may have even been stuck for a decade. And so these are just a couple of prompts in terms of where we see organizations fall down on this. And so on the left are some of the pitfalls and some of the better actions that we see. So one of them is that the case for change has 2 faults. One is it's just kind of generic. It's like, oh, well, it would be great for, if women are 50% of the population in the world, we certainly should have more women. But more fundamentally and more damaging is the fact that their aspirations truly lack the leadership buy-in and commitment from the top leadership. And that lack of role modeling is a fault line that goes all the way down into the execution. And so when leaders take the time to say, why does this matter for our organization? Why does it matter for me personally? And what am I personally going to do about that? Makes a huge difference in terms of being able to set the stage for programs and a journey of success. We also see incredibly arbitrary goals set, without the underlying analytical rigor. And as most of this audience will be economists or economists by aspiration, as I would call myself, without the data and without the analytics, you are basically throwing spaghetti at the wall in terms of your initiatives. So you should be not surprised that your initiatives are unclear in terms of the ability of them to have impact and to have measurable impact. Which also the spaghetti to the wall is another pitfall that we see, which is, it's 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, okay, well, let's just try everything. First of all, organizations don't have the leadership capacity or the time to operationalize everything. And it's incredibly imprecise to what problem are you trying to solve. And it's not just, we're just trying to solve diversity generally. It is what pinch points specifically in your organization or your culture that you'd like to get better at. The other piece is just thinking that a bit of training will be kind of the cure-all. So one of my pet peeves, and you're welcome to ask me more pet peeves in the experience of having thought about this from a research perspective and having responsibility to implement this in my own organization, is a 1 hour hit and run unconscious bias training is not going to help you actually be that much better of a leader. So it's great to do the training. And many of the unconscious bias trainings are incredibly good, but it needs to be complemented by a series of capabilities and shifts and, frankly, incentives and accountability that the training is matched by, so that you're actually changing the culture and leadership. And then the last piece we see, and especially I think has been a concern on racial equity this year, is it's just the flavor of the month. It's just the flavor of the year. And what will be very interesting coming into now into the summer is, companies, the corporate sector in the United States alone committed $64 billion to racial equity focused on Black and African Americans. That is a lot of money. What I am excited to see is how is that money having impact and the sustained power of those companies to stay the course, because it's not just a commitment from last summer, it needs to be a multi-year commitment. To actually affect their own organizations and the communities that they're committing that capital to. So those are a couple of starter thoughts. I look forward to the questions and the discussion, Mark, but hopefully that gets the virtual room going, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lareina, for the data. We do love data at SIEPR, and for those insights. Just, we've got some good questions in already. I encourage others to send in more questions. And I think I'm going to start with a couple of questions for you about the sort of corporate world, and then talk a little bit about public policy, and then a bit about academia, where a lot of the people who are watching today sit. So let's start with the corporate world. Can you just share with us a bit, sort of which industries, sectors do you think are sort of doing relatively well in this space versus, still have a long way to go? How would you sort of, and obviously there's differences within the sector. Some companies don't, are different from their peers, but what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So if it were a class, there's no sector getting an A, but there are some B- sectors, I would have to say, if I were to be, grading fairly. So some of the sectors that do better are retail, healthcare, and they do better in a very specific type of way. They do better in terms of front funnel. So they do a lot better in terms of entry level. So in healthcare, you oftentimes see that it can be 60%, 67% women at the beginning. You'll see companies with very large entry. There is a broken rung, but because they're starting so high, their manager level actually looks pretty good. And so you see a lot of that in, I would say, retail, consumer, and healthcare. The challenge, though, for those companies is that the shape truly looks like a funnel, meaning very wide mouth, and it narrows down. So when you get all the way to the C-suite, maybe you're 35%, but you're not actually significantly better than the average. And what companies have been trying to do is kind of go from 25% closer to 30% women, which, by the way, is not equal. It's just a third. But, I guess 30% is on the road to 50%. So what's fascinating about the companies that are doing better, or the industry sectors that are doing better, is that their key challenge is actually to take the incredible front funnel talent that they have and actually advance that talent to more senior levels. And that's the key challenge. And then those who are doing worse, I think if you look at industrials, if you look at aerospace and defense, if you look at tech, those tend not to be the best sectors, but within there are some silver linings. And so what's fascinating is the high performing companies in those sectors tend to look like pipes. So instead of that wide mouth kind of narrowing down, some of the highest performing tech companies that I've worked with will start entry level, especially because it's very engineering heavy, at maybe 35%. But they'll keep that amount through all the way up to their executive ranks. So they may end at the same place as the pharma company or the healthcare company, but the act of being able to retain and advance a population throughout is fantastic. So that gives me some hope for some of the laggard industries.
Great, thanks for that. And I think I'll intersperse questions from the audience too, because of my sort of breaking this into categories. So my next question just concerns sort of what role you think data in this space provides. So if you're a company, you could and there's lots of different ways that you can present the data, and the data, how you present, let's say, how you're doing, like with respect to what share of your workers are female or underrepresented minorities and what have you. But what's your sense of, is that an important, a place, a relatively low hanging fruit kind of place where companies could do a little better on that front, being transparent about their workforces? Is that, and how helpful could that be to potential workers, to potential companies that are going to contract with them, customers, and so forth? Do you see do you see data as playing an important role in this area?
Well, I do. Partial to my personality, but also professionally, I would say it does. So if you step back, data, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. And data is the sunlight here. Because what the data shows is that you may perceive that you're improving. It shows that you actually are improving at a snail's pace. And when you say it doesn't feel like maybe things are equal, it actually gives you the precise amount, right? And so I think that that investing in the data to understand your current state is really important. Also leveraging more of the advanced analytics to get predictive about where you could actually see bending the curve. So an analysis I've just run for a client is, how would you bend the curve? So on your current course and speed, this is where you'll be in 5 years. It just is. Well, you don't like that result. Okay, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you would change in that equation to get there? So data can be incredibly important. I think one of the things that's changed over the last 2 years in the US specifically is transparency. So prior to that, I think companies worked a lot with data, or higher performing companies had a lot of data, but it was something that only exec team would see, the board would see. It was kind of quiet. And to be honest, there are a lot of lawyers running around saying this is not, the norm would not be to share this, right? To protect the enterprise and to be thoughtful in many ways, not to be a blocker, but just, the perception was we wouldn't share this. I think that's shifted. And you currently have a worker and talent generation who would like to see the transparency. So what you start to see in the annual reports is that companies are being much more transparent about their data, and some of it doesn't look good. Oh, well, it's not a great PR moment. And the purpose of sharing your data is not PR. The purpose of sharing your data is that people in your organization know where you are, they feel informed, and they have buy-in to the journey to improve. So if the average population of Black workers is 12% and you have 6, you publish that you have 6.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. Now I'm just going to pull a question from the audience, and I'll sort of bounce back and forth. And this is a question for students. So do you have any advice for, this is from, I think this may be from a student. Do you have any advice for Stanford students interested in working in the private sector to advance DEI? Are there opportunities for new graduates, for example, to work in DEI consulting Or should students direct their job search to entry-level positions in corporate human resources?
I guess all of the above. So are there opportunities? There are sort of boutique companies that are thinking about DE&I. There are also some fantastic startups, particularly in the Bay Area, that are using machine learning to solve like bias in recruiting. I mean, it's just like super interesting to take different skills and capabilities you have to provide kind of a point solution to a big problem. And then within larger corporations, there is the kind of talent track. And DE&I is oftentimes a sub-function within that. That is being more invested in. So I think if you're interested, I would say you could do any of those things. The other thing I would say is that let's say that you are passionate about DE&I, but you also are incredibly good at investment banking, and you're incredibly good at M&A and driving deals. You could do those two things together. And what I mean by that is you could become a fantastic M&A banker. You could become the head of the group. And oh, by the way, as the head of the group in a business role, you have an enormous amount of power to create opportunity for underrepresented groups. And so you would never have to leave your care and proactive stance towards DE&I. So one of the things that's, you can spend time in the function itself, or also if you take a P&L type role, you can also take a leadership role there.
Great, thanks for that. Another question from the audience, slightly coming at this from a slightly different part of the organization. How do you garner executive buy-in for this, as opposed to just kind of, lip service, like, oh yeah, it sounds great, we're totally committed, but how do you genuinely garner their buy-in?
Yeah, very difficult, can take time. One of the things that we use is a mirror workshop, which is a technique where you play back the experience of what's happening in an organization. Because I'm generally a very optimistic person. I'm a half glass full type of thinker. And you don't have, very rarely do you have leaders who are saying, how do I make diversity worse? What their experience is that they're stuck in terms of how to improve, or what they should do differently, or they haven't gone on the journey themselves. So the mirror workshop is a great way to kind of play back what's the experience happening within an organization, because generally leaders will say, wait a second, that I didn't know. And so then how do we work through I didn't know to now I'm conscious about it to I'm a leader and I need to take action.
Terrific, thanks for that. Another question. So we got a lot of great questions from the audience. So I have some good ones too. I want to make sure. So what DEI initiatives, tactics have you seen being implemented in large for-profit global companies that noticeably increase allyship? And then a follow-up from the same person. And how do you avoid the sentiment of the largest groups across the company feeling disenfranchised?
Oh, that has a lot of components to it. So the first piece about global allyship is I think that for global companies, the core theme really is inclusive behaviors and inclusive leadership. And allyship is a technique within that, or program you can run. But outside of the US, spending the time, let's just take Europe for an example, exploring what inclusion means and the local context to which it occurs is incredibly important. So just sort of exporting the model from the US, as you can tell from the term that I chose, is not really a recipe for success. Actually spending time in terms of what inclusion means if you live in London, if you live in Paris, if you live in Dubai. And taking that time and having inclusion being the underlying leadership quality makes a huge difference. And your second question was about large groups not feeling disenfranchised. I'm going to give you a really simple answer, but obviously there's a lot under the iceberg. Fundamentally, large groups need to be listened to. And like the lack of listening tends to take a riff that's already big and make it a lot bigger. So, and that is I think a pitfall that some organizations have fallen into, and others over the course of this year have really leaned forward on to have courageous and uncomfortable conversations where senior leadership may not have an answer. And that's a vulnerable space for senior leaders to be, which I would encourage senior leaders to be, and I would encourage those who are, leading these groups to create a safe space to do that.
Great, thanks for that. Another question about the remote workforce. So in the view of this attendee, this clearly helps the hiring funnel, but aren't you concerned that it may further impact women's ability to advance in the organization and help to develop the culture? Which is to say, if everyone's remote, it's hard to move the needle on the culture, perhaps harder now than 15 months ago.
So full disclosure, I mean, I obviously spend all my time, as a partner in our tech sector. So I'm a big fan of collaboration technology. So I do think you can build culture without always being there in person. I think what the remote culture will do at its best is to be more purposeful when we need an in-person interaction, because it will drive an outsized impact in either a decision that needs to be made or maybe a culture moment. But being more purposeful about when in-person matters and making the investment around that is going to matter a lot more. The flexibility that especially working moms and working parents gain is immense, as well as diversity hiring from different locations across the country. So, on a personal level, I'm willing to take a little bit more remote with a little bit more skill in terms of being leaders and setting up what's an in-person moment, what's a virtual moment, to allow for more flexibility.
Great, thanks for that. Interesting question here that I've heard about at Stanford. I don't know if it's as big a deal in the corporate sector. How pervasive have you seen employees being unwilling to self-identify? At Stanford, for staff, we see roughly 1 in 5 staff members decline to state or leave their race blank on the survey.
1 in 5 sounds high. In the corporate sector, I haven't seen that much. I have had lots of discussions with CHROs or chief diversity officers that how the options you give for how people identify and when needs to sort of be improved. But I haven't seen such a large amount of prefer not to answer. But what's hard about that question is I don't actually know what's under that. So it just immediately makes me think, well, why would people feel that way? Like, and why?
It's surprising to me too. I don't have my finger on the pulse of the survey data, but that number is surprising to me too.
Very high number.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit to talk about public policy type issues, and we can come back. I know there have been more questions in the corporate sector than I've been able to ask, but I just want to go into this space a little bit. So I was, in advance of today's in our session today, I did a little research and saw that there are some things to celebrate in government in the U.S. So we're talking mainly about the U.S. and I want to get to other countries in a sec too. But in the U.S., if you look right now in Congress, adding up the House and the Senate, there are currently more women than ever before. And there are more underrepresented minorities than ever before. So, things are going well in that direction. Are they good enough? I mean, I think, probably not, but I think right now, 144 out of 535 representatives or senators are female, and 124 are minorities. And on the minority number, I couldn't get the comparable number 20 years ago, but the 124 is a 97% increase over 20 years ago when there were only 63. So there things have been moving in a at least on this kind of front in a good, more diverse, let's say, direction. What's your take of what's behind that, and is it your sense that we have similar growth ahead in the private sector? Because you get the numbers you gave for the Fortune 500 are much lower, the CEOs. Much lower than those other numbers that you presented. So it does suggest that as you go further and further and further, it gets even lower than the C-suite numbers that you were talking about. So I don't know, do you sort of see, or do you see a plateau happening? Your thoughts on that?
So I think the first piece is the increased representation in government is fantastic. And I think those numbers, you need to carry those down to state level in terms of governors and mayors, and I don't think it's quite as rosy. But that being said, just having more representation in government is important. There's a simple phrase that I always leaps through my mind, which is, if she can see it, she can be it. And if you can see our vice president, and this, this has been written a lot of times, but it is so true. If you see, as a woman of color, as a little girl, if I see that the vice president is a woman of color, it changes my aspiration implicitly, but it also may change some big decisions I make over time. It also may make me make decisions at the point of students here at Stanford in terms of where I go next, and where is there a shot for me to lead. So all of that is fantastic. I still think the numbers are quite low, so it's a moment of progress, and then you need to continue to push the line forward. And so there's still quite a lot of work to be done there. On the private sector, I think for the largest companies, the CEO numbers are very grim. The board numbers look better, and the C-suite looks better. Do I think that we'll see, over the next 10 years, a significant increase? I certainly hope so. But I think the challenge is it's not going to happen organically. The system isn't at a place, we haven't hit a tipping point where it naturally will come together. So it does need to be forced and intentional. And that's not what all companies are doing.
So, circling back to the sort of the intersection of policy and corporate America, do you think there is a role for public policy, more of a direct role for public policy in this space? And I'll just take as one example, I'm a big fan of the National Football League. I've watched a lot of games. We're not at that time of year, but for the past almost 20 years, I learned this preparing for today's event. I didn't know this before, but the NFL requires its teams to interview at least one candidate of color when there are openings for head coach positions. I don't think they have a requirement that they interview at least one woman for NFL head coach positions. But anyway,
locally, if you follow the 49ers, they do have a female NFL football coach. Right. So you could, but yes, I agree.
Yeah, right. So is there a role for policy to, in this, because the numbers, I think the number you gave earlier, the number of Black CEOs, for example, was really low. I don't know.
It is very low. So let's actually just take the NFL, for example. So the NFL, if I remember correctly, of CEO positions for NFL teams, there is only one Black CEO, and that's the Washington football team. And I know that because he's a former McKinsey partner who was a former NFL player who basically broke glass right there. So your question, is, given the players, is representation of Black and African American men, at least in football, in the management of football, significant? I would say there's room to improve. But your question about policy is a great one, which is a policy around increasing line of sight. That is something a lot of companies do, including the National Football League as an organization. That's a great thing, because oftentimes you don't have, diverse, call it maybe the familiarity bias, or a little bit of who you know. You may not realize that they're incredibly qualified candidates that are there. So adding to the slate can be a fantastic thing. Changing the requirements, I think you don't touch that. So you don't touch the meritocracy bar, but you can change in terms of slates. And that's kind of the Rooney rule that a lot of corporates use, which is, if I have 3 people, I want to make sure that if I have 3 Black women in the final, that I have 1 Asian man. And I'm just juxtaposing it because it's usually not that combination. But the idea of the Rooney rule is that, 1 out of 3 has something different to bring. it drives a different set of search. It also, think of it this way, provides feedback to potential candidates, whether they get the job or not, to have a sharper view of how they get the job the next time.
Super interesting. So thanks for that. And there are, we've talked about some numbers that are good. There's obviously numbers that are not so good, and the sort of equality, equity fronts. And so one question that I have for you has to do with sort of, if you look out at the world, compensation of employees. So in economics, we think a lot about people's earnings. And there's some very influential work done recently by the dean of the Yale Business School, Kerwin Charles, with co-authors, looking at what's happened over the years to earnings inequality between white and Black Americans, and it hasn't moved much. And so there are, are there things that you look at, low-hanging fruit for policymakers in this arena? Because it has kind of plateaued to some extent. I mean, it depends on exactly which metric you look at, but like income and wealth inequality has remained very high by race and ethnicity, and then also by gender. So I'll give you an example of a policy lever. So in the US, we tax income, and this is more of an issue on the gender front, I think, than on the race ethnicity front, but we tax income at the household level. So that means if you're at let's say you have two people in a couple, and the second person goes back to work, their tax rate right off the bat is often like 40 or more %. So there's like a strong financial disincentive for them to enter the workforce, whereas many other countries have individual-based tax systems that may, and that may partially explain right now why women's labor force participation has been lagging other industrialized countries. I don't know, are there things that energize you in this space? We are the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. So is there anything where you think like, right now, President Biden, for example, is doing some stuff on childcare and trying to subsidize childcare more. So anything that pops out to you as especially obvious for policymakers to do?
I think it's worth turning over all those rocks and taking a fresh look at that. I think that we rest on our laurels. We would say no, and there are reasons why we don't do that. But I think everything from parental, childcare, parental leave, and I say parental because I think it's really important to support men who want to take leave or who may have the primary responsibility of taking care of the kids, to what you're getting at in terms of pay equity. And it is worth really this is why we need organizations like yourselves, because you can't just think of it as a policy itself. You actually have to understand the second, third order effects of it. And it requires actually the deeper research. What I can say for the corporate sector is it's a no regret move for corporations to be investing in pay equity analysis and understanding where they are for their own populations. You don't need to wait for the EEOC to come and do a checkup on you. You can do a checkup on yourself every year. And corporations certainly have the ability to at least take a look at the pay equity issue on their own. Probably like they also, and I'm not a tax expert, but I also think companies can look at parity of benefits as well, especially like tax deductions for dependent care and things like that. So, just a very simple question for corporates is, have you taken a fresh look at your benefits, and are they as generous as your next competitor? And you may find that answer is no.
Super interesting. Thanks for that. And I've got a bunch of questions. I'm not going to be able to get to all of the attendees' questions, which I apologize for. Let me get one quick one from an attendee. Then I have a couple that I want to ask you about academia. So this one, I'm sure you could go on for a while, but but here's the question. What would you recommend a corporate board of directors do if the CEO is sincerely engaged in bringing diversity change, as do all of this person's direct reporting executives, but after years and years and years, the executives at the top remain 100% white male? In other words, they're all sincerely vocally in favor of diversity, but just not for their job.
as a board of directors, I think you can hold your management team accountable for the results. And so that is a huge lever. A second lever would be that you can have a board level DE&I task force or advisory council, or something that provides oversight, just like you have other governance committees. The other thing is that you also can be a part of the talent decisions, and maybe back mark to something you suggested earlier, making sure that the slates are diverse.
Great. And then one related question that I sort of alluded to earlier. How does the US do on this front relative to other countries, other industrialized countries? Are we ahead of the pack, middle of the pack, lagging the pack? Where would we be?
Well, to the earlier grading scale from my days remembering.
I want to quote you for my Econ 1 students that the B- is the highest grade. I'll see what
exactly. Exactly. That might make them feel better. Yeah, I don't think life grades on a curve. So it's a hard lesson to learn when you leave academia. The comfort of school that you just don't get an A anymore. I would say the U.S. is probably in the B zone, not leading, not the worst, and it varies on different dimensions. Always it's interesting under the averages. On simple things like if you look at OECD countries and maternity, paternity, or maternity leave, we're at the bottom. Real basic thing. If you look at percentage of gender and women CEOs, even though our low numbers are low, I think it's something like 2% in China and India and in countries like that. Whereas their front funnel, if you compare kind of front funnel and middle, look in China can often look a lot stronger than the US in certain industries. So it's, and if you look at the Nordics, and it's something that people have known for a very long time, the Nordics are like, well, we have quotas. We have quotas for the board, and we have quotas, we have targets and expectations for management teams. And even some companies in Germany are starting to elect towards that direction. So I would say that, if you do the scoring on individual classes, not just your overall GPA, our overall GPA is quite low. And on some of the individual classes, we're sort of bottom of the rung. And in other cases, especially for some of the leadership pieces, we're actually not that terrible. In terms of what we do on race, it's very unique to our context. I think you could maybe say the UK has some parallels, but really for racial diversity, that's something so contextually specific to the US.
Yeah, and just one final thing, and maybe you can comment on this. We could devote an entire event to this topic alone, but academia generally and the economics profession specifically we also don't get an A on this dimension. It is a somewhat different set of issues in the academic arena than in the corporate sector. So just to take one example, in academia, one of the things with academia, if you want to be, let's say, a professor, you have to go to grad school for a long time. Mm-hmm. I was talking earlier about the income and wealth inequality. Mm-hmm. And, so I've had a number of students whose families don't have a lot of money and the thought of, let's say, delaying for 5 or 6 years before they're making money doesn't seem that appealing relative to going to work immediately. So there are like things like that are sort of
practical things.
Practical things that make it a big challenge. But any words of wisdom from your time in the corporate sector that you have for academia generally, or the economics profession specifically, in terms of, and we could do better on both the gender front and the race ethnicity front.
Look, I have to be honest when I'm out of my expertise depth. I'm not super deep on the academic sector. I would say as just maybe, a pedestrian comment of someone walking by and observing as opposed to having expertise. To me, I think there's something incredibly powerful of just taking the concept of opportunity creation and fully blowing out what that would mean. So, and this, so how I could imagine that in the academic sector is opportunity creation at the very beginning. So, what are the economic incentives, as you just described, to actually invest 5 or 6 years in your PhD, in your research, and in that journey? What are the fellowships that provide you the sustenance for the research that you need in those 5 or 6 years to be remarkable, to actually get an adjunct professor role at an institution like Stanford or any one of the of our kind of leading universities? What are the opportunity creations to get the prime kind of projects and research grants depending on your discipline as a professor? What are some of the work to debias committees and evaluations for tenure? I would just imagine very systematically, if you take the thread of opportunity creation for historically underrepresented groups, and you take that at every single moment and you say, look, in the course of a 20-year career, a 30-year career, there are important moments of truth that bring our best minds into the field. And, not go to Wall Street, not go to McKinsey, stay in academia, right? And when we hire PhDs, I myself didn't imagine myself at McKinsey, probably more imagine myself in academia or policy at the very beginning, right? But, what are those moments? And what do you do to increase the opportunity creation and the optimism that keep talent advancing? Because if you get stonewalled, there are so many opportunities for anyone at Stanford to do a number of things. And by the way, they're interesting opportunities too. So how do you make it more of an incentive to stay? I guess that's what I would say as a passerby or walking through campus.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much. And it doesn't have to be either or. I'll just say that I have some friends who did, for example, McKinsey before grad school, so they, or even after grad school, and then go in the professor route. So I think there's.
I have a very good friend who did end up. He's a professor, I think, at another institution, an economics professor, but he did spend some time at McKinsey, and it was really fascinating. This is what I would say to students: is go try something. So he and I did a fellowship together, and then I did public sector, he did McKinsey, and then we swapped. And we overlapped by a little bit of time. And I said, oh, I think this is fantastic. I'm having the best time here. I just can't believe how much I like it. He said, I thought it was okay. And I said, oh, here is the difference. And then he went to go do his PhD. And I was like, I'm going to stay. And so there is something to just exploring and experiencing and finding that connection to your work. Because I think, especially if you're a woman or you're a person of color, that connection to purpose and joy will be a guiding light, because you're definitely in for a tough road, right? As the data will show. But if you really like what you do, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lareina, thank you so much for making time today. I'm sorry that we're a few minutes over, but I could go on. I could easily spend a few more hours of this. This is super interesting. So thanks. And thanks to all who tuned in. Hope to see you at our next event in 2 weeks with Mark Carney, and more details to follow soon about that on climate change and climate finance. So thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you soon.